Hello there, I'm Reed Cardwell, and I'm standing outside the Art Academy of San Diego. Inside is the current exhibition of my paintings and sculpture titled The Usual Characters. Let's go inside and take a look. Let's begin with this painting. It's titled Founding Father. It's a triptych of our first president, George Washington. I did a whole series of presidential portraits, starting with Washington and going to the seventh president, Andrew Jackson, which you'll see in a moment. I was inspired by the 2004 presidential election. I was impressed with the high voter turnout, the strong emotion expressed throughout the entire country, a lot of heartfelt feelings. It made me want to take a look at the institution of the presidency. Now, I'm basically an abstract painter, but I have realistic roots. 20 or 30 years ago, I was painting realism, and that's evidenced here when I did these small details. But let me show you what I did first. I just did a generic, here's a digital color photo of what I did first. It's just a generic version of someone who lived in the Revolutionary War times. I think anybody would say, well, yes, it's George Washington, but it doesn't really capture his likeness. So what I had to do was look at famous paintings like those of Gilbert Stuart, who did over 75 portraits of George Washington. Because in the late 1790s, photography did not exist. It wouldn't come into being for about 40 more years. So I had to look at other artists' paintings. So this somewhat caricatured version in oil of Washington, I think captures him, was based on Gilbert Stuart's portrait. And then, separately, I did the nose and the mouth, and then the eye. Now, the nose and the mouth, I just did as a detail, and then I realized maybe back in my subconscious, I had been suppressing the realization that my maternal grandmother had the same type of lips. And I wonder if it's a coincidence that both George Washington and my maternal grandmother had false teeth. But anyway, kind of a Freudian connection. The detailed eye refers to perhaps the eye on the dollar bill, but personally to me, I always felt like when I learned about George Washington in elementary school, his eye was always watching me and watching over me to make sure that I do the right thing. It was kind of like not only our national consciousness, but my conscience saying, Reed, you better do the right thing, be a good boy. Moving along, we've got our second president, John Adams, our third president, Thomas Jefferson, our fourth president, James Madison, the father of the Constitution, our fifth president, James Monroe, our sixth president, John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, and in progress, not finished, Andrew Jackson, our seventh president. What I wanted to do was to capture the realistic likeness of the presidents, but I wanted to bring my own modernist technique. So what I did was I painted all the expressions in oil with applications of charcoal pencil. But what I didn't want to do was copy the backgrounds like the White House or locations behind it specifically. So what I did was I interpreted color symbolically. Let me give you an example with Jefferson. The definitions for yellow can be more than one. One is intellect. He was a very bright man. He wrote the Declaration of Independence in his 30s. He was multi-talented. He was an architect. He was an inventor. He wrote the words, all men are created equal, but he held many slaves. Another definition of yellow is deceit. So does that represent deceit or hypocrisy or conflict? I think so. He was a very complicated person. He stood for states' rights on one hand, but on the other hand, as president, he purchased for $15 million the Louisiana Territory, known as the Louisiana Purchase, in 1803 from France. And that wasn't even specified in the Constitution under presidential powers. So he was a conflicted person. Also, partisan politics started in the presidential race between Adams and Jefferson in 1894 and in 1800, when Jefferson tried to portray Adams as an aristocrat. I think that's where political spin really started, because Adams was a common man. He lived in a small home outside Boston. Jefferson was the true aristocrat, and he wanted to deflect that label away from himself. Why don't we now bring out the sketchbook? People ask me if I'm going to do all of the presidents in this painted form, and I respond, I'm going to try it if I can, but I'm going to do one president at a time, because what I want to do is study history and read up about the presidents. And I just don't want to paint the heads. And so what I've tried to do with that in mind is over a period of just a few days, I did this presidential sketchbook on accordion type paper. We start with, to my right, my far right, George Washington, and work our way through our 20th president, James Garfield. Notice that I used 4 pages for Abraham Lincoln. I had to fit him in sideways. He's generally acknowledged as our most brilliant or memorable president, so I decided to allocate more space to him. Okay, we're going to turn now, because that's only half the presidents. The other 23 are on the other side. And starting with, to my immediate left, our 21st president, Chester Alan Arthur. And I think it's notable historically to mention that Grover Cleveland, our 22nd and 24th president, the only president to serve twice non-consecutively. And then to my far left is our current chief executive, George W. Bush. I had a lot of fun doing these. I started, I think, rather loose doing George Washington, and then it got a little bit tighter, and it was a real challenge. And so even if I don't finish doing the presidents in full-size oil paintings on canvas, I've got this sketchbook. So I at least have covered all of our chief executives. Okay, let's collapse the sketchbook and move on. Thank you. Let's go to this piece here. The title of it is Peace. I think that's a subject that's on all of our minds right now. It's a painted wood box. I didn't make the box, but I want to do work that's three-dimensional, in other words, existing in space, and not just a canvas painting hanging on the wall. So this is my attempt at three-dimensional space, and I also do sculpture, and this was a plaster cast of a clay sculpture of a head. And what I'm going to do is turn this just so that you can see the other sides here. Here's the top. So here's a figure here. Vertically, here's the correct orientation. Then I'm going to show you the back. So I'll turn it so you don't have to walk around. And then at the bottom, now this is the side that isn't shown very often. Here's another face here, and as you can see, there's a hole for the screw that holds the sculpture here, because it had to be adhered and fastened. It just was a lot of fun, and it allows me to work in three-dimensional space. I think it's time to move on to the next painting. This is called, I went to a party and a guest ate my homework. I need to explain what that means. There's a fun little story about this. I took a two-day workshop from a local painter and teacher by the name of Ernie Silva a couple of years ago, and he had us doing various exercises that involved our own lives biographically, our backgrounds, our picking another artist's work, and I included all these, and I started it Saturday and had it in progress Saturday night. Before I came back to class on Sunday, I went to a friend's 60th birthday party, a surprise party. And after a little while of celebration, I had to leave, because I said, well, I got to go back and work on my painting. I got homework. And this kind of surprised the guests, and they said, well, you don't have to leave. You could just tell the class that you went to a party and the guests ate your homework. It's kind of like the old saying, the dog ate my homework, teacher. That's why I didn't get my homework done. But it worked. And so I actually wrote that into the painting. This is a painting that I love. It's hanging in the Frick collection in New York City. And it's painted by the British painter Sir Joshua Reynolds. And it's a painting depicting General John Burgoyne, the Revolutionary War British general who lost the famous battle in the Revolutionary War at Saratoga. I love this painting. I've wanted to try and do a painting in my modernist style for years. Maybe doing the presidents will allow me to find a way to do him. Until then, I've collaged it. Now, when you use a collage and duplicate another painting by another artist, so that you're not accused of copying or plagiarism, you have to give credit to the other artist. So what I've done is I've formally titled this, I went to a party and the guests ate my homework, after Reynolds. So that keeps me out of trouble. Let's move on. This is a painting of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. It may not look exactly like him, and somebody asked me, speaking of plagiarism, they said, well, aren't you concerned with plagiarism, copyright infringement, because you're copying him? And actually, there is no law against painting a public figure, a political figure, and I joked, well, actually, it's not that good a likeness. But as you can see here, there is somewhat of a likeness. I was inspired by this enlargement of a painting, of a photograph actually, from Newsweek magazine, shortly after he was appointed president of the Russian Federation a few years back, I think in 2000, replacing Boris Yeltsin. And I just loved the idea of the perspective and him sitting in space, and so I tried to achieve that. And I wanted to do it mainly in gray tones, with the exception of the yellow here, to just point out the focal point that I wanted everyone to see the face. I've got him a little long in the body. As I said, I wasn't trying to make it an exact portrait. I'm also influenced by the painter-sculptor Alberto Giacometti, and so I think that's what led me into doing the gray tones. Putin will return later on in this tour, but let's go over here and talk about some other paintings. This is a portrait of the Russian-born painter Nicolas de Staël. He was born in Russia. He immigrated to France. He was revered by the French. And he's an abstract painter, so the style that I've painted him here, somewhat realistic, very realistic for me, representational, is not the type of paintings that he did. He did very colorful abstractions. A student of mine who was married to a Frenchman and has a book on de Staël had these photographs, and when she showed them to me, I said, my gosh, what a charismatic looking figure he is. And I was just really impressed with just the look of the gentleman. But I didn't do anything about it. 2 years ago, in the summer of 2004, I hit a wall, a painting block, if you will. I didn't know what to paint. I even briefly considered, well, do I want to keep painting? My immediate answer was, well, yes, I do. Well, what do you want to paint? Well, I simplified it to, well, I just love to paint shapes and lines and shapes. And I tried to simplify it just not to put any pressure on myself. But then I happened to see this likeness, actually this photograph here, and I decided, well, this has been laying around for a while, Reed, why don't you do a painting of him? But it's very important what I did use in this from the photograph and what I didn't use. As you can see, when I'm going for a likeness, you have to use a photograph. And that's what I was after here. But what I did do is I created my own three-dimensional space in gray halftones. I also chose to drop out the flesh tones, and I just included the Prussian blue. That's become a favorite blue of mine. So it's just as important what you include and exclude in the photograph. In other words, use a photograph to let it help you. Don't let the photograph use you. Or as I learned from my mentor, don't paint what you see, but paint what you prefer to see. And so this literally saved me from a painting block to where I was able to continue on. And I think, in fact, I know, led into the presidents. Let's go to the second painting. This is de Staël in his studio. And this clearly even more shows the editing technique that I like to use. Here's the photograph. And as you can see, here's a hanging lamp with a wire. Here's a wood or a cardboard box. Here's various paraphernalia. You can see some of the paintings he worked on. This is all extraneous material. I decided to take what worked most for me, what interested me, and that's the figure. And then I designed and chose and selected and edited, if you will, my own sense of space. Then we go to a close-up, and this shows even more my selectivity. Here's Mr. de Stael in repose, and again, there's all this what I considered extraneous detail. So I just cut in very closely, and I just did a portrait in gray tones. So again, what I was taught in art school, and I've tried to practice, is whenever I've used a photograph or looked at images or looked at anything, don't paint what you see, but paint what you prefer to see. In the case of photographs, use the photograph to your use, but don't let it use you. Let's pick up again with the idea of Putin. This is an abstract version of the Russian President Vladimir Putin. I actually started this painting, the top, it's a diptych here, 4x4 of the head, and I was doing a demonstration, a painting demonstration. I didn't know it was going to be Putin. This is an example of just starting somewhere, and out of the act of putting brush to canvas comes the idea for a painting. And I worked on it for about an hour, and it didn't look anything like this. I developed it the next day in my studio, and I thought, my gosh, that's Putin. I'll call it Putin in living color, but I need to give him a body. So I went to the art supply store and got a matching canvas. I'm going to go over here and point to this side. And I decided, since Mr. Putin was a product of the Cold War, or he was raised in the Soviet Union, to make this black and white, kind of reminiscent of the 50s with Sputnik, or the 60s. He's got the Russian Federation, but if you notice, if you look really closely here, I've included or snuck in a little tie clasp of the hammer and sickle. So I mean, he was, let's face it, he was head of the Russian KGB. So he is a modern president, perhaps, or is he at heart a Cold Warrior? I don't like to make statements so much in my art rather than raise questions, and then the viewer can supply the answer. Let's go to this piece here. This is a bronze, and the bronze is painted in a dark green patina, and to me it shows a great influence of Alberto Giacometti, the sculptor and painter, Swiss-Italian, on my work. Also, I think a strong influence is primitive heads or images, such as the Rapa Nui or the large heads from Easter Island. But what I try to do is be inspired by other work, but not copy it. This shows a little bit more of Giacometti's influence. This is a sculpture that he did. This one, kind of taken with a little tongue-in-cheek about Rapa Nui, I called it Nui Nui. And then let's move on to this painting here. This is called Red Face. People ask me, is this you? Is this me, Reed? And I say, perhaps. It looks kind of like me. I'm red, I've got a long nose. They say artists draw or paint their own types, their body types. I wasn't looking in a mirror. Actually, I teach a lot of painting classes, and what's valuable to the students, I've found, is that I do a demonstration the first class, and then I can continue the demonstration sequentially each week and try to work on it only in class. Let me demonstrate. This painting started like this. So here's the first version. And actually, there's a smaller head. And then the next week, I'm going to turn it very slowly upside down, because now you can start to see the shape of Red Face take shape on the next week. Then, as you can see, it starts to come into being. I've got the eyes, I've got the light areas, the dark areas, and then you could start to see it really take shape. And then it's really close to where it is now. Of course, I went back in and gave it some more red and some embellishment in blue, but that kind of just shows my process in continuity of a painting. Okay, I think that's enough in the outer room. Let's go into the inner gallery. Now we're in the inner gallery, and this is a painting that it was a lot of fun for me to do. As you notice, I've got hands coming off the canvas, because I didn't do a very good job of blending. I had the hands painted on the bottom edge, and it looks like a crazy figure dancing. And again, it's just an abstract because I wasn't looking at anybody, and I decided to have them done in cardboard But Stuart Burton, one of the owners here at the Art Academy, said, well, why don't you use wood? He has a wood cutter, so he used the cardboard as templates, and he cut them in wood, and I used thickening gel, molding paste, to merge them to the arms, and it looks like a person dancing. And has anybody ever heard of that song, Let's Dance by David Bowie? When I see this, I think of that, and that's as much as I'll dance. I think my dancing is expressed through that piece. But I can't look at this piece, and I really couldn't paint the piece without thinking of the song, and so now you know what I feel like when I see it. It's a lot of fun to do. Let's go to these paintings over here. I wanted to add to the show with some colorful small abstractions, and the way that they fit into the show was to put them on in the corner, and so that they kind of worked opposite all the heads. Doug Simay, who curated the show, he explained it like this: Reed, your exhibition here, The Usual Characters, is basically the male head. So how do we make these work? They're nice, colorful little canvases. They're small. They're for a small price. People can easily collect them, take them home. But how do we really make them work? And with a curator's eye, what Doug did was he took that painting, Let's Dance, and the next painting that I'll talk about in a moment, and used those as bridges to work into these little abstracts. They could be landscapes. They could be not objective paintings. But he took the Tim Burton movie entitled Mars Attacks as an inspiration. If you've seen that movie, what happens is the Martians are finally defeated from their attacking Earth because they play, and this is straight out of Tim Burton's humor, they play, the people, Earthlings, our people, play country western music which causes their heads to explode inside their space helmets. So Doug said, imagine if some of Reed's heads in this room, colorful heads, were to explode. This would be the result. And I kind of like that. I think it works. And I mean, it defies logic, but that's the way that they ended up on the wall. Let's go to this painting here. It was a fun little piece. It's painted in acrylic with collage, which is gluing paper and gluing a previous drawing that I tore out. And it is painted on masonite, wood board. It's called High Sailor. It's just experimenting with a lot of color and texture. I just had a lot of fun doing it. Moving on to the next piece, this is one of the few women in the show. This is entitled Woman at the Memorial. What I have here is a woman, and then behind her is, it's hard to tell, but it's actually a wall, and then a figure, and then a large bronze sculpture. What this alludes to is a piece that I designed for the World Trade Center Memorial Project, the Twin Towers, from September 11th, 2001. It was the largest design project in the history of the world. 5,201 entries from around the world, and I was, like everyone else, moved by the events that happened on September 11th. And so this bronze sculpture is actually part of my plan, and it existed in the plaza between the two Twin Towers, and you had to recognize the footprints, which I envisioned as large pools of water. I don't know where this placed in the exhibition, but once it ended, I wasn't able to pull a light switch, take a switch and just turn off my passion and energy for the work, and so it ended up in my paintings as my background. So that's why it's there. We're going to move along and go to the next piece. This is a large painting of a male figure. He appears to be leaving. I title it Exit. This painting was also started as a demonstration, and for the longest time it just existed as the figure but in different colors, and I got tired of looking at it and I decided to change it. I chopped off the head, I chopped off the arms, and I made the torso a head of a large figure and the shoulders, and that really shocked some people around here, and they said, well, you shouldn't have done that. It was one of my favorite pieces. My wife thought it was a terrible idea. My mother-in-law said, I'm mad at you for doing that. Imagine the audacity of me changing my own painting. But what I learned from that was you can resurrect it. Okay, it changed for 24 hours. It became a different type of figure, from the full body, or almost the full body, to the head and shoulders. But then I realized, well, since everyone seems to be missing the figure, I'll bring it back. And I made it better. I created more tension. I brought him over to the right. And that's what I remember about this piece. It's important to keep yourself open and listen to other people's thoughts and ideas. Moving right along. As a child growing up in the 60s, I enjoyed reading comic books. It's called the Silver Age of Comics. And here's Flash. But instead of literally coloring his uniform red, which it was, I decided to go for the red in the background. This is untreated raw canvas, and I used charcoal, and I love the reaction of the charcoal to the raw canvas. And so this is a mixture of some life drawing observed from real life and just my own imagination. The companion piece next to it shows kind of a strange-looking Batman, and again, a mixture or a blend of the observed life drawing and imaginary pose, using some paint and charcoal. I just had a lot of fun using the Batman. Maybe it's a subverted view of Batman, but I had a lot of fun with it. Now, moving to the next piece, we have this large canvas entitled I'm Batman. This piece and the piece following that, the point I want to get across is what I learned about staying with drawing or painting a piece over time. I started with just drawing the head of Batman, and I realized it's Batman, and I couldn't go any further because I got nervous about developing it further, so I just had to set it aside for a few years. So what I learned from that is if an idea isn't continuing to come to you, set it aside. And over time, I was able to find the body, and then I found a head, and I thought, well, what's that head about? And then I realized, here's one of the books that I collected back in the 70s, and it's a cover of a DC Comics. Batman was a DC character, and it shows Batman, and the figure behind it is the villain bent on world domination known as Ra's al Ghul. He was played in the recent Batman movie, Batman Begins, by the actor Liam Neeson. And so without trying to literally copy the likeness of Ra's al Ghul, I created this head that says, Batman, I've got you in my sights, and so that's what I tried to create here. Now, the title Batman comes from a line in the first Batman movie, directed by Tim Burton, where the first time that Batman is seen by the audience and by a perpetrator, say a petty crook, is when he's caught in the act of burglary and Batman has him, he's lifting him actually off his feet. And so from the character's perspective, he's just in utter terror, and he's saying, who are you? Who are you? And he's looking down like this, and in that husky tone, now I'll be Batman, he's holding the perpetrator up like this, portrayed by Michael Keaton, and he's grabbing his shirt like this, and he's looking up and he's saying in that low husky voice, I'm Batman. And I thought that would be the ideal title for the painting. So that's what that's about for me. Comic books is a large influence in my life. Another painting where, like the Batman head, kind of got me stuck for a while, where I didn't know where to go next, was this head of a pig. I did it very quickly. Again, the raw canvas holding in the charcoal. I love to draw directly on it. And then I painted around it. But this, again, like the Batman painting, sat for years because I recognized the pig as Wilbur, this beautiful pot-bellied pig. He and his friend and brother, Dewey, lived at the petting paddock of the San Diego Zoo and the Children's Zoo for many years. They passed away, sadly, a few years ago. I used to go visit them and sketch them about 3 times a week, and I realized, well, that's Wilbur. Where do I go from there? And what really encouraged the completion of this piece was the deadline of this show. And so deadlines are good. They organize you, they make you work. And I thought I would call it the Ballad of Wilbur, but I had a student who said, why don't you call it This Little Piggy? I said, that works. Let's move on to the next piece. Again, here's a large head, 4 by 4, 48 inches by 48 inches on a canvas that I did. Started as a demonstration, and it's using acrylic paint and mixed medium, watercolor crayon, heavy paper. When you adhere paper to a canvas, that's known as collage. And the title is called Wham! I think it alludes, again, the comic book influence. If you remember that 60s campy show starring Adam West as Batman, when Batman and Robin would punch the crooks, there'd be these big block colorful letters like wham, pow, bam, and that's kind of the impact that I wanted to have on the piece. I'm going to move between this painting and the next painting here to show what inspired these large heads. Quite often I'm asked, Reed, why do you do large male heads that are bald and painted in different bright colors? It's a reasonable question. I don't have a logical answer. I think it has something to do with, again, my love of comic books. This is a character called Martian Manhunter, and he was a marginal character. In other words, he was not a headline character, a main character. He has become a headline character in the late 90s, early 2000s, but when I collected comic books in the 60s, he was little known. But I do remember him, and I think subliminally, in my subconscious, the Martian Manhunter, the green skin, the bald head, has found its way into these paintings. This is titled We Don't Agree. There's two people here, and what I do from time to time is create kind of a dialogue, whether it's between two people in a painting or someone looking at the viewer and engaging the viewer. Going to the next painting, it's probably the same idea of the bald head, the male figure. I like the use of watercolor crayon. You can see how it's kind of scratched on. It has a double use. You can wet it and it behaves like watercolor, or you could spray fix it with an aerosol spray and it just holds its drawn stroke. This painting is titled Think. I think that speaks for itself. Going on to the next painting, which is nicely framed by Stuart Burton here at the Art Academy, is called Yellow Orange. I don't really recall what the idea behind my head is. Basically, it's on a canvas panel, which is a cardboard wrapped under canvas, and so it has a different type of it reacts differently when you paint on it than a canvas stretched on a wood support. There's no bounce to it, and so the reaction of the charcoal is different. But I combined charcoal and acrylic paint with a minimal use of color. Just had a lot of fun with it. Let's move on to this piece here. This is a stand-in for the original piece, which was a bronze sculpture. That was removed as someone purchased the piece and wanted to take it for Valentine's Day. So this box is a stand-in. I'm going to just turn it so you can see the different sides of it. And again, this is another opportunity to bring my art into three-dimensional forms. I'm going to turn it again so you see the inside, and I'm going to briefly tell you a story that I get a kick out of. I was working on this figure right here, surrounded by the yellow and red, when a family friend by the name of Gordon Blaylock, who lives on the East Coast, I don't think he understands modern art. I was sitting down working on it, and he was standing over looking at me working on this part. Now, set that image aside for a moment. To really make this story work, Gordon had a son. Let's go back in time a little bit. His name is Chris Blaylock. Chris was very talented, and he was a student here in the late 90s at the University of San Diego, an art major, and he didn't quite know what to do with his life. He needed some direction. I think his father did not want him to go into art as a career, and I think he became convinced of that when he saw me painting on this piece. I talked to Chris and I said, Chris, if you want to get together over lunch sometime, not that I'm an expert, but I can give you the upside or the downside of making a living as a visual artist. And he said, sure, okay. That's the last I ever saw Chris. Now, let's go back and go forward in time to that moment when Gordon is standing over me. I think he was concerned about Chris kind of not doing anything purposeful. That's how he saw making a living as a painter. Gordon was ex-military, and he was looking down at me working on this piece, and I happened to look up, and he was about to leave the house, say goodbye, go back to the East Coast. If I could put words to that expression on the man's face, the father's face, it was a pained smile that said, there is absolutely no way I'm going to let my son do that for a living. In a short time, we heard that Chris joined the Marines. He went to officer candidate training school, I think with a slight nudge by his father, Gordon. He's had a successful career in the Marines for the last few years. He's a captain of artillery. He's been able to avoid being stationed in the war in Iraq. He did visit Iraq briefly and came home, but for the longest time he was in Guam serving as an admiral's aide, and he might have gone to Iraq even sooner, but because of his art ability, he was doing graphics in the staff of the admiral. I think it's fair to say that art possibly, quite possibly, saved that young man's life. Anyway, that's the story. So I'm going to go over now and talk about this piece again briefly. This is another painting of acrylic and watercolor crayon. You can see the etched version of it where it's just dry and spray fixed, and then how it has a double use where you can dilute it with water. It's called daylight. It's kind of just the effect of light on a figure. Nicely framed by Stuart, a nice wood frame. And now we're going to go to my sculpture. I'm a painter. I'm not really a sculptor, but I love to sculpt. So we're going to talk about a series of pieces here. First off, we're going to talk about this. It's called a maquette, or a model for a large environmental sculpture. There's a piece in front of this that we'll talk about in a moment that's the bronze of this piece. This is actually a wax piece that I painted to look like a bronze. And the people down there I purchased at a model train shop. And if the average person is 6 feet tall, then the length of that sculpture is meant to represent like 100 or 120 feet in length. And the whole surface is actually wax, and I treated it with Naples yellow and some granular gel, acrylic gel, mixed with the paint to make it look like sand. So I would envision this as a large environmental piece on a sand dune, perhaps in the desert, but it could be just on a large patch of sand somewhere in urban San Diego. I think of it as, it's called Gasping Man. I think of it as somebody coming up for their last breath or going down in quicksand. I think it would be a fun piece. And moving down here is the artist proof bronze. Both pieces were based on a little clay model that I made, and the bronze was cast and mounted on wood, and that's called Gasping Man. Moving up over to the wall is a small painting with one of my oven-fired clay sculptures. I didn't have to take it to a foundry to have it cast. It's a little clay called Sculpey that you can fire in your conventional oven at 275 degrees for 15 minutes. But try and envision that painting without the sculpture, because that's how it began. The title is Mission Accomplished. Now, where does that come from? Well, we remember our president, George W. Bush, in May of 2003, on board the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln, announcing that the hostilities with Iraq had been finished, or that the mission had been accomplished. Now, to take a balanced view of the situation, I think we can all agree that that was a little bit presumptuous, because the war is still going on, and so it was a presumptuous statement. The mission had not been accomplished. And I learned something in doing that painting. I thought, oh, what a clever artist I am. I'm just going to do a political satire, and the black in the painting refers to the oil in the Middle East, ha ha ha. Well, I had something to learn here. I think this is an example of art imitating life, because the painting actually wasn't finished. My mission was not yet accomplished. As I like to do, when I think a painting may not be finished, and I looked at this, I was suspicious of it a little bit. I thought, does it need anything else? I looked around my studio and I found that sculpture. And I like to experiment. I just at random placed that sculpture on top of the canvas, and lo and behold, it worked. So I used some glue and glued it on, and now the painting is finally finished. So I thought I was being overly clever saying mission accomplished, but art imitates life. My painting was presumptuously, it was not finished. Now it is. Now we're going to go to the left of that with the blue sculpture in the back in the corner of the room, and then you can truck over to the sculpture in front of it, the blue silver sculpture. Both of those, again, there's the bald man in different colors. That's using the oven-fired clay. Before I fire it in the oven, what I like to do is take a cutting tool, like a knife, and cut edges across the planes of the head. Again, the human head is a curved surface, and what I was doing was really exaggerating the curvature of the surface. It just gives a different, powerful look to my figures, and so that's why there's some sharp edges to both of those pieces. Just had a lot of fun doing them. Doesn't take a lot of time in terms of sculpting them or firing them. Let's go to the painting behind the sculpture, and that is called Deng, D-E-N-G, named after the former premier of China, Deng Xiaoping. And it's not meant to be a literal likeness of Deng, because it doesn't look like him, but the colors are reminiscent of a cover of Time magazine that had his portrait at his passing a few years ago. This was part of a larger painting that was a 9-part painting that was part of the South Africa, Johannesburg, South Africa Biennale back in 1995. I didn't get to travel to South Africa. I was exhibiting with the group of Southern California artists, but it was exhibited there. And then when it came back, I decided to break up the pieces. And Doug Semay, the curator of the show, felt that this worked nicely in this collection, so that's why it's there. And then going to the right, there is another version of the clay sculpture. This is cast in plaster of Nui Nui. I just like the idea of taking the base and painting it a different color, red, rather than the black head. And now let's conclude with this final piece. It's called We're Not Supposed to Be Here. It's a lot of fun. It's a very long canvas using collage, which is pasted paper. And again, I've got some sequential photographs that show the sequence of this painting. It started, again, in a weekly class. Now you'll see this bears no resemblance to the finished painting. I'm going to go to the second photograph. And you can start to see just a little bit the head, but it looks nothing like that finished head. The third version. Okay, then I decided, well, let's simplify it and go for a blue background. And then this figure here starts to take place over on the left. Then the next version, and we start to have a body for the figure, the main figure, but the head is still rather just curvilinear. Now a lot of work has passed between the previous and this painting, this version here, and you can see the similarity to this in the finished painting. Then it's just a matter, I kind of found my way home from here, and then it's just a matter of honing down this figure and deciding if this head is right. I decided to keep this little head there, and then it's basically just redesigning the head to where this is just a reproduction of this painting here. I had a lot of fun with it. It was a challenge working on a canvas this shape, but a lot of textures. Well, that brings us to a conclusion. I'd like to thank you for joining me today for my exhibition entitled The Usual Characters. Thanks again.